Hello and most welcome to 1037 of the Heidegger series. And I would today talk about contradictions, the working of the cerebellum and a healthy living organism. All things very important, especially today when humankind is pestered by a decrease in health. And I also want to make a pointer towards Heidegger and the expression Sorge, care. And Heidegger is mentioned that, especially in context with Sorge, with the Dinge, with the thing. Let me set the foundation first. Well, I think it's a good starting point with Gibson. I think that is really telling for both the modern time and how we work. James J. Gibson was working within psychology, and he's one of the few researchers within psychology because it's not really an area that research is being done. It is mostly hypothesis based, and it uses indirect methods to prove the assumptions that are already laid. For instance, something that we often mention, the division between mind and body. That has never been proven. But did you know that there is a very big disproof within psychology itself against this founding division, so to speak? Actually, within psychology itself, not without it, but within. Have you heard anything like it? And this is done by James J. Gibson. And that is actually a deconstruction of many of those things that are so incredibly limiting to human understanding power, and so detrimental to both our spiritual health and our corporal health. He showed that, starting with young children, that the hypothesis of an inside, that there is a continuous person, to be completely disproven. He showed that very clearly environment changes behavior, not inclination, intention, creative ideas, or whatever that supposedly could take place within the individual. This is a very important hypothesis in psychology, and I would say without it all would fall. And this is the reason psychology is not very accepted by the philosophy of science and not from the harder sciences. It's a very insincere foundation in psychology, and according to Gibson, normal psychology is a cult, Freudian cult. You have to believe in it. No, environment is the changer of habit. Put them in the playground, put them into a different playground, put them at school, put them in nature, put them in different sets, red-colored sets, open sets, narrow sets. They all change their behavior, and those behaviors are pretty similar. And those behaviors, you know now, is thinking. And this is so important when it comes to Heidegger, because he does not recognize or found his ideas on this presupposition, this hypothesis. all of academia base every inkling of their thinking on that supposition, a supposition that Heidegger does not acknowledge. It is not within his writing. And most interpreters of Heidegger do actually put that into his philosophy. That's very interesting, I think. But it will hinder you from understanding anything from Heidegger. Anything. Actually, if you don't change your behavior, your thinking hasn't changed either. Nothing of the thinking can change if there is no behavioral change. That's the reverse side of the coin. And to understand Sorge, you must understand that. Sorge means that we put effort into changing our behavior. And that effort needs to be incredibly strong. Otherwise, behavior would take the form the environment creates. I would say there's zero chance of understanding that without understanding that academia is based on the hypothesis of a division of mind and body, an unproven hypothesis, which makes it so much stronger, because what you never speak about and what you don't recognize as a division acts in the background beneath much stronger. It is a part of experience, and that is a part of experience cannot be uncovered, cannot be changed. You can do nothing about experience. It's just there. And it was experience Heidegger wanted to reach into, and therefore he never took up into his thinking. His neologism are not affected by this. That's why Dasein can never ever be equalized, why there's psychological terms, self or consciousness or anything like that. He rejects that completely. And how many interpreters haven't I read that make an equation with Dasein and self or consciousness? After you've done that, no understanding of Heidegger can come. It's the same as thinking that this is a lawn and you only need a lawn mower to produce the grass. It's a very, very serious misunderstanding. It's a misunderstanding that makes all understanding impossible, and the gift of Heidegger does not come, because what Heidegger presents is not a new philosophy, it's not a new take, it's not a new opinion, because that is just the academic changing of words. Doesn't change your behavior. What he actually wants to do is change your behavior, what you do, how you care about the things, because the things are the thinking. You don't have thinking and things, you have just thinking and things. They are the same thing. I think a pointer could be this. Imagine that you're an inventor and you invent some fantastic machinery. Why not the Antikythera mechanism? Where do you draw the line from what is your thinking in the Antikythera mechanism, on the material side, so to speak, or on the thinking side that's supposed to be inside somewhere? It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And it becomes more clear when you do complicated things. And that's also a point from Heidegger. When you do the simple things, you are sort of occupied. And you don't notice that Dinge and thinking is the same thing. And making thinking into something that is not, it is devaluing thinking and make it into only denken without danken. Thankfulness, gratitude, or creativeness, or praise. I would also call it a blessed thinking in comparison to the unblessed thinking, the stale thinking, the rotten thinking. That is the foundation of today's lecture. This is what I will try to sort of expound a little bit more. See how pedagogical I can be. Well, let's think about contradiction in the ordinary discourse, in the discourse of opinion, where you acknowledge or sort of indirectly, unwantedly believe in the division between mind and soul. You are under its grip. A grip that is very hard to get out of. It cannot be argumented against. It has to be discovered in a very complicated way. Whereas not to establish the division once more somewhere else. That is the main problem. And I would say that is part of the project of Heidegger. Contradictions is not something specific. We mentioned that with Hackett, that the negative is not the same as the positive. It's more complicated, you learn it later. It doesn't have the same purpose as the positive. That could be easily shown by the different proposition. In is learned first in the child. Into is learned secondly, maybe a couple of months later. But out of, that is a negation of all direction without one, into. It's much more abstract and complicated and takes several more months, maybe up to 5-7 to learn. So they are not twins, positive and negative. A statement and its antithesis are not the same and not similar. Making them similar, it's a simplification, and simplification, that's the only thing that can stop you from understanding. That's the, so to say, enemy of understanding. There is no other enemy. And once you started to do simplification, no amount of effort will take you out of it. Because every time you read something, every time you study, discuss, listen, your ears will be shut. They'll be ridden by contradiction, so to speak. And nota bene, when I use the word contradiction, it's in this simplified form, as if they were of similar nature. It's a grand illusion, and that illusion also is the culprit for establishing the idea that the world is binary, an idea you find in the movie The Matrix, in the book The Matrices. It's, I would say that's the general idea of everyone in the Western Hemisphere. Everything could somehow potentially be reduced to ones and zero. That is assuming that 1 is the absolute negative to 0. In reality, it's not. It can seem that way in a limited case. This is something we took up when we talked about constructed mathematics. But I think you can see now how this idea establishes the LEM, the law of the excluded middle. That presupposes that they are of the same nature, the positive and the negative. They are not. And then, law of the excluded middle is out of the picture. It's a weird simplification somehow. You don't even have to understand it. I would say it's not possible to understand the law of the excluded middle. It's just a blockage, like a roadblock. If you drive on the road and you hit a roadblock, what is beyond the roadblock you cannot see. You will never ever see. And the idea of contradictions being of a similar nature is the same roadblock. The third take on that could be to make etymology. The Greek word for what we usually perceive to be contradiction is anti or anti. It has actually the significance opposite. Like in the Antikyra mechanism, comes from the island or close by the island of Antikyra, opposite to Kyra, Antikyra. That is a more true to the fact than bluntly or clumsily or oversimplified think of it as a true contradiction, whatever that would be. It has a very limiting power on perception as well. Perception gets diminished by contradictions or the simplifications of contradictions. And one healing factor was something I read of Pasi Kylkinen, and that the universe has a distinction between appearance and reality. And here you have a true dividing line, so to speak. Well, not very sharp. Something that is appearance, I open my eyes and something appeared to me. I send something out. This is the beam of the eyes. This is the audible, in some case, hearing signal of your ear. A signal you need to train. And it's harder to train the ears than to train an instrument like the clarinet or the oboe. And no one is born with that skill. We are all different in skill level, just as we are with the oboe or the clarinet or the trumpet. It's just the ear is much more complicated, so harder to make it skillful. So there goes the democracy or the equality of perception. It's not a fact of reality. By understanding this, according to Pari Pulkkinen, we can learn to project our imagery towards something other, something radically different, and we can also inhibit the taking in what turns up too hastily. Decide what it is. And this is exactly taken from quantum mechanics. You need to wait. You need to set up the experiment, that is projection, and then you need to wait. A classical physicist will always preempt and say that the material thing was present from the beginning. That's not waiting. Waiting is to let the thing be reality by itself. And whereas it sounded so objective from a classical physicist to say that a material object is already there, it is sheer subjectivity. It's the worst case scenario of subjectivity. It doesn't get more subjective. You turn something into something that cannot be of reality anymore once you grab it and calls it something. This is naming of the voice. It blots out everything of reality. It doesn't allow anything of reality to come to the fore. And you become this closed off simulacra without connection to reality. And not having connection to reality is being simple. Simple-minded and not very complex. And the less complexity you have, the less perception you will have. The less joy, the less understanding, the less knowledge, and to a lesser degree your decision will end in success. To claim anything else would say we are not part of reality. We don't have any influence of reality. So you see here, when it comes to the juicy stuff, what really happens, what seemed to be a small difference I would even say that classical physics to many level in a very flat level doesn't really, it's no big difference. And to many physicists and theorists, like for instance Max Tegmark, there is no big difference. But when it comes to reality, it makes all the difference. It makes an incredible difference. Because it changes how you behave. You become more active, and if it changes behavior, we know that there is also change in thinking. So Max Tegmark will never ever change his thinking. He will never ever progress. He will remain the same, and he will never learn anything. But he will rename. There will be a renaming process. That will be this rumination, this regurgitating, and he will find it himself interesting. But it cannot be interesting, because interesting tells its own language. It is complexity that is interesting, not according to a standard, not according to rules of correctness that are instigated by the institutions of academia and most of classical physicists. No, this is true interest, this is true beauty, not something that is compared. Just a scale in Julian Barber's vision of the world is not something that you make by comparison. It is there in a true sense. It doesn't need a double take. It speaks its own language. It's sort of a scale that doesn't exclude. Whereas the normal scale excludes something. Because it says, this is more important. This is what I contrast. This is 5 times bigger than the other one. And you don't even go into the distance in between the two. In the reality of Pylkinen, which is also something suggested by quantum mechanics, especially in the Bohmian vision, we can wait and we can become more harmonious. And the way to go about that, both in quantum mechanics and in an Heideggerian vision, is to change your behavior. In that way, you change spiritually. You become more elevated, and you can change your predictions. Your projections and retention can become real, no longer just fantasies. Because real reality, so to speak, sorry about the alliteration, real reality doesn't say that something is better or worse by comparison. Just one thing is better by itself. Doesn't need to be compared, doesn't need contradiction. It speaks by itself, just because it is more complex. Complexity is the teller of everything. A teller that does not ever need comparison. There could be only one complexity in the world, and that would still speak its own language. You see how quantum mechanics, oddly enough, from the first outtake we thought there is no big difference. I thought that myself until the 900th lecture. But now on a deeper level, it makes all the difference. So on one level it looks the same. It looks like quantum mechanics is on the same level, but its contradiction, it contradicts classical physics. And in the end, quantum mechanics is the one that is proven right. And that was my working hypothesis. It's still true, but when you go under, you see that there's a whole other world where it's like looking at two icebergs. They have the equal height. Of course they are different, but they look all the same. But you make a contradiction for some reason. But when you start to look underneath, One iceberg is just like 5 meters deep, whereas the other one is like the one that poor Titanic hit. 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, I think it was 100 meters wide or deep. It's not easy to tell that just from a quick look. And you can also say that there's, so to speak, normal take on reality, or space-time knowledge level 1. There everything seems to be exhaustible. What does that mean? Well, exhaustible is that potentially, might never happen, but at least potentially, the world can be discovered, acknowledged, put into proposition, could be conquered, could be abstracted, it can be turned to zeros and ones. That is not possible. The world is not exhaustible. And the reasons for we think it's exhaustible, or would say that, because that is actually something that can never ever be understood. Once you get into it, what is around the corner, you look in front of you, you see nothing, and then you go forward and you look to the right and round the corner, you have this simplification of contradiction. Yes, simplification of contradiction has constructed the idea of exhaustibility. It's a killer of contradiction. For instance, in the case of Titanic, it could have been good to have a contradiction. So you put them into opposition, the two icebergs, for instance, iceberg A, iceberg B. Why do you do that? Well, it's a sort of indicating that they might not, they could, but they might not have the same properties. You see, it's a helping tool for our thinking. And once it can be a helping tool for our thinking, it can help us to further our thinking and our modalities of being. And we can all of a sudden be allowed to be on different levels. We can acknowledge that the icebergs on the visual space, or another example, above the surface, are exactly the same. Whereas negation here can imply that there could be a possible distinction. This is this couldness. You see, that's a different quality in contradictions. Could be. Whereas the simple take on contradiction says it has to be completely different. And that it has to be completely different makes for a simplification. And that simplification makes it impossible, where you have either to assume that the icebergs are distinct in an abstract way, or you can understand that the iceberg has a quality underneath, a potentiality for being different. And that makes the whole difference. This is what causes us to realize it is a potentiality. A simplification would be that you assume that they are completely different. And if you stay there and you have to make a choice which iceberg you steer into, that simplification could make you just pick one of the two. Whereas the more complicated contradiction can make you look further for indications. Eventually you can actually end up in the same decision, but not before further and deeper investigation. So you see why Heidegger, Gibbsonian theory, quantum mechanics, it's just not only theory, it's much, much more. On the surface it's just theory, the first taste of it is just theory. But then you understand slowly it is so much more. So I sort of killed off exhaustibility, and that is also the project of Paul Feyerabend in his book The Conquest of Abundance. I really do recommend it because it could be incredibly helpful to understand these differences. These differences should not be explained by contradictions. They should be explained not in comparison. Comparison should be left to where it's suited, not be an overall clumsy working concept. And now maybe it is clearer why Heidegger speaks so much about the Dinge and the Sorge for the Dinge, and that how that helps erkenntnis, understanding, to feel in. Because clumsily using everything in the same way, maybe a screwdriver to fix both opening of a tomato or an avocado or an oyster, and fixing the screws and doing other things, is going to be clumsy. Using contradiction in the same way in so many different places will not fit the case, and it will also be foundational for a general sloppiness. That general sloppiness happens at the very same time in the outside and in the outside. There is actually no difference, but as a working principle you can say it's a difference. It could be very hard to speak to each other if you don't sort of in a speaking manner accept it. But don't accept it to depth. See that there are lurking about differences that we usually don't understand, when not to a level enough complicated. I'm going to put in another example here to show that this is mighty interesting and incredibly helpful. How you can have different takes, and let's start about Newtonian. The example is coming from Newtonian physics, and how a different take on matter make Newtonian physics itself more interesting, and how there can be a decisive difference in a contradictory manner of thinking and physics, the actual meeting point between the inside and the outside. So this is coming from The Conquest of Abundance. Our anachronistic convenience, we give matter three different names. First, the proper mass, quantity of matter, a certain constant value assigned to each classical atom. Second, inertial mass, which is a measure of its resistance to motion. And third, the gravitational mass, evident in the mutually induced acceleration of bodies at a given distance from each other. Logically speaking, it is quite remarkable that these three values would coincide. So a logician would construe the word mass as standing for only one of them, but say that the physicist's talk was ambiguous between the three. That's very interesting. So a logician would have another take on it than a physician. And here you see how different conclusions can erupt because the different takes on it. If you take it in a certain matter, you will have this conclusion, but take it in a very different matter, you will come to an entirely different conclusion. And that different conclusion will in the end make a difference. Gracias. Will in the end make a certain characteristic difference. So contradictions can lead you astray, and therefore we need to look how we treat the dinghy, because understanding and a deepening of understanding is always done with a change in behavior, how you treat the things. And I think this is one of the differences between Heidegger and the common classical physical takes on these things. In the common classical physical takes, we devalue behavior completely. And there are many reasons for that. But devalue behavior is related to taking away the body, because the body is somehow doing the behavior, and that is uninteresting. And to go according to that thinking, it doesn't matter how you put a glass of water in front of you, how you treat your cups, how you polish your floor, how you dress yourself, how you clean yourself, how you shave yourself, how you pronounce different things, your intonation, your body stature, your balance, your coordination, your hearing, which also is a physical thing. Physical hearing in contrast to abstract thinking hearing, which is completely passive and cannot perceive anything, as so clearly proven by Iain McGilchrist. Really recommend the Matter with Things. Do buy that one, because that will be an eye-opener to understand these immense differences. There is shown that a person who doesn't train his hearing, he cannot have hearing, and will have hearing to much lower level. And if the hearing is low enough, he will confound what he understands with what he doesn't understand. So he doesn't even know what he understands. And he will be one of those, maybe like me earlier in the lecture series, maybe to some extent still. I have to put a disclaimer there. But just be a sounding machine. A sounding machine who doesn't understand what he or she says. And because there is not enough complications to have two levels, a thinking talking level and an awareness level, where he can see if his thinking / talking is correct. That level, the higher level, doesn't exist. So from his take, what he says is shared by everyone else, so he doesn't have to put much effort into his act. You see how the body gets pushed away. Our acting is part of the body, and you see the extension of the body is its act, or maybe it's even the same thing. And that is hated among academia today. Nothing is taught about it. Everything is taught about it in ancient times. It was showed how to behave, how to think. This is thinking. Standing like this and thinking on the inside doesn't change anything. It is this constant voice saying this is different. This is the take or the movement of neologisms, name changing. This is what academia is about, changing the names on things and having a horror vacui. And the vacui is knowledge. All academia is about, it's getting rid of knowledge, to have simple repetition, and that everyone have their special language, so nobody can understand each other, and therefore an assumed complete understandability can progress. And that is the only communal language within academia. Therefore knowledge is a threat, as I said in the last lecture. That's the worst threat of them all. That's the spectre, the phantasm that can never ever enter into academia. Because once you put knowledge in, you will slowly understand that my words don't work, and you will understand slowly that I don't share the meaning of the words with other people. so my voice doesn't get heard. And because I can't hear my own voice, my hearing is not active, I can't discern that. But when knowledge comes, I'm starting to discern that. And then, if you get a taste for it, you want your words to mean something, then you will progress. And then you will develop the power to make your words mean something, fractally, complexity-wise. And then academia will have no value, neither as a negative nor as a positive. It would just be valueless. It would be like gravel on the ground, not something to criticize. Paul Feyerabend really warned about that. Don't criticize the conquest of abundance, academia, because by doing that you give a body to something that is just nothing. It's as worthless as the rejection of Derrida at Cambridge. Doesn't have any value. Criticizing it gives the impression it has a value. But then you've gone so far that you're becoming healthier, because balance is acutely connected, as Iain McGilchrist showed with his research report. I think it was 3,800 different research reports. A working brain does give health in all examples, whereas a non-working brain, the simplified contradictory brain, takes away the health from the body. It causes immune diseases, it causes Asperger, it causes ADHD, causes lack of focus, discoordination in the body, which now is an established word, and that causes extensive damage to the body. So you have these two things to choose with. One is the common view, what will destroy your body, your mind, will make you look like a couth or the village. I don't even want to say the word, but it can also be the starting point in going into complexity and train your hearing, make it possible to you to hear again, and your vision. So you can see the colors that were perceptible in the Renaissance. Very interesting chapter, both in Conquest of Abundance and in The Matter with Things. How our sense of color, depth and all that has disappeared, and we cannot see the beauty of nature anymore. This cannot be seen by the common populace, and that's it's an extraordinary price to pay, not be able to experience this. And this, of course, will be passed on to the next generation. This complete lack of skill and complexity. Less complexity cannot read this complexity, therefore it will be no experience, and therefore classical physics is not merely something that quantum mechanics contradicts. It is something much more. It's a depth quantum mechanics, and that depth makes it better to live, and you get this nutrition, so you don't have to daydream anymore. Make up the pleasures, you can have them. And this is Heidegger showing there is no pleasure in modern man. I want to show the path again, and the path is the poem of Hölderlin. Is coming back, he has anticipation, his walk become firmer because he's going to get something. In academia you can never gain anything, and therefore you don't put any effort into it. It's just repetition, acknowledgement by somebody else, obedience. Yes, only obedience, because it's authority by random at a certain happenstantial moment that decide what is correctness. It's really ludicrous list for what is real. It's just beyond belief. Who would believe that humankind would sink to such a level that would be lists of what is true and what is not true, and that truth could be a comparison, and only by comparison we can have truth. I think that's absolutely nonsensical and horrid, but it's not like that. And once you're starting to get a taste, as in the first example, if knowledge for some reason would be allowed to seep into academia, which it never will, but imagine it would, that person or those persons will never stop. because they will understand in the end everything can be gained. Everything that already Plato was dreaming of, the fullness of reality, and this horrid dullness that he felt, that the world didn't have any colors, it didn't have any tonalities, his hatred for music, his hatred for art, it was all based on him not being able to have an experience. He wanted one, and therefore he dreamed up the cave experiment, the cave idea. And today the cave idea is the most prominent feature in human beings. They live in a simulacra, and that is proven. That's why you should read Iain McGilchrist, The Matter with Things. And I think that amount of research material can never be beaten. I hope it's been beaten, because it's going to prove it even more. But it's just beyond belief. 2 good recommendations today also about my trying to explain a little bit about Sorge and Erkenntnis. I will put all those things in the list, the links. But The Matter with Things by Iain McGilchrist and The Conquest of Abundance of Paul Feyerabend. Huge recommendations, and I say thank you very much and strive on. Knowledge is actually not something to be feared. It's an incredibly sweet fruit, maybe the sweetest fruit that ever existed, like a persimmon. I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye for now.